Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm talking to an expert in sports psychology about a fascinating study that was only made possible because of COVID-19. It's a subject that will be of interest to both sports fans and non-sports fans. Now, if you like sport, particularly football, that's soccer for my American listeners, then you'll be familiar with the concept of the home advantage. This is the idea that teams playing at home have an advantage over the away team. In part, this is to do with the familiarity of the surroundings and the fact the team haven't had to travel far to get to the game. But a huge element is also played by the crowd, and it has an impact not just on the players, but also on the referees. In fact, it's deemed to be so significant that many competitions have rules that require games to be played over two legs, so each team plays home and away. In knockouts, when the number of aggregate goals scored across two legs is the same, away goals are deemed to count for more. Thanks to COVID, and there's a phrase you don't often hear, researchers were given a unique opportunity to assess the impact that crowds had because games were held without them. It's what the Germans call Geisterspiele, ghost games held behind closed doors. This is interesting, not just for sports fans, but for anyone who is intrigued by how we're influenced by other people. After all, a crowd is just a collection of people. And if we think about the position of the referee as akin to a compliance officer, trying to ensure the players adhere to the rules of the game, there are some things we can learn from a human risk perspective. My guest is Dane McCarrick, a postgraduate researcher at the University of Leeds, whose interests include the psychosocial factors underpinning sporting excellence in association football, with a particular focus on how psychological stress influences performance. In our discussion, we talk about the home advantage study and then move on to talk about Dane's broader work looking at the psychology of sport. We explore how pressure and stress impact sporting performance, and there are some lessons in there for all of us about how we manage those dynamics in our own lives, whether or not we play sport. It's a wide-ranging discussion that I think you're going to really like. So please enjoy my conversation with Dane McCarrick on the home advantage. Dane, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi, Christian. How are you?
I'm very well. Listen, it's great to have you here. And clearly, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. Can you give us a little bit of a pen portrait of who you are in your areas of interest?
Absolutely. So I'm a postgraduate researcher based at the University of Leeds. And I suppose I come from a psychology background. I'm interested in sport and health psychology, interested in stress, sport performance, and principally the factors that underpin sporting excellence, I suppose, which is something we might talk about a little bit later, I guess.
Yeah, as long-time listeners to the show will know, I have this fascination with psychology, particularly around football and sports, because I think that can tell us a lot. And you've recently published something that grabbed my attention, which was looking at this dynamic that we've had, thanks to COVID. We've had this dynamic of football games, so that's soccer for my American listeners, where there have been no spectators. And that produced some interesting dynamics that you as a scientist were curious about. Can you talk a little bit about what the thinking was there and how you came to be studying the research?
Absolutely. So we were interested in this long-standing phenomena in football, whereby home teams tend to be more successful than away teams. So it was a jointly led study by the University of Leeds, Northumbria University, with my colleagues Nick Neve, Sandy Wolfson and Maren Bilicic. And so it's probably useful to add a bit of perspective at this stage in terms of what the home advantage is. So it's whereby home teams are continually more successful than away teams. But like until now, this view is entirely been based on comparisons that we've made between the success of teams when they play in their own stadium versus when they play away from home in their opponent's stadium. And so these previous studies have taught us, as you allude to, a key factor for home success is the crowd, spurring on that home advantage and providing a motivational influence to its players. So what this COVID-19 pandemic has allowed us to do for the first time is compare the success of teams at home in isolation of their fans, away from that support that they normally have. And obviously this is a novel opportunity because it would never have made any financial or logistical sense to remove football fans from stadia for the sake of a psychology experiment. So yeah, that's in essence what we set out to look at.
So tell us a little bit how you did it. So it's pretty obvious. So there was a period of time where there was no football for obvious reasons, and then it was decided, I think Germany went first, which is we'll do it in a COVID safe way, and clearly to be as COVID safe as possible, you don't have the spectators. So this thing starts, and so suddenly you've got these data sets. How did you go about analysing them and thinking about structuring the research?
Okay, so it was a case of just acquiring the data as it came in, really, kind of naturalistically to how different governments around the world impose lockdowns, different waves of data come in. So I think amongst the first to do analysis was on the topic was scholars from the University of Reading, James Reed and colleagues, and they looked at what was happening to the home advantage in these countries, and not until we looked at the Premier League in months to come, just to kind of get an insight as to what might be going on. And we seen that the home advantage was diluted. Teams weren't winning as much at home, and there was actually some quite interesting geographical fluctuation amongst the different countries that were looked at. So yeah, that was the earliest research into home advantage on the back of what's happened because of the COVID pandemic. And then we, from our research group, just kind of waited to see what might happen in terms of the publications that came out, things that people looked at. At the time, we were acquiring data to look at. We were trying to get the biggest sample we possibly could. But for our study, we analysed just shy of 5,000 games, and again, a bit of fluctuation amongst the countries, but 25% of those games were played with fans at the start of the season, and around 75% without fans. And we looked at 15 major European football leagues. So all the ones you think of, the Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, which is of course be interest to you, Christian. And yeah, this was about 11 different countries. So yeah, we asked the question, will home teams have the advantage? And when we acquired that data, when it all came in, we were quite startled really by the outcome, because we expected that there would be a decrease in the home advantage, but globally speaking across the leagues, but our statistics suggest it was actually halved. And so what we know from this is that when teams at home play without their fans, they pick up half the amount of points and half the amount of goals. And I suppose in the most basic sense, this reveals that fans matter, and playing at home has a significant sporting advantage.
Wow! And so you've literally just looked at the results and said what's the difference in the outcome. I think you also looked at some of the sort of disciplinary aspects of it as well, so yellow cards and that sort of thing as well. How were you sort of collecting all this data and thinking about that broader piece?
Okay, so the data was acquired from footballdata.com, quite original name, I know. And there's a couple of
Yeah, what do they do?
I wonder what they might do for a living. Yeah, so we acquired the data from there, and there was a few. I think the 538.co.uk. There's another data portal use. That's what's amazing with modern day science now. So much data is available for us to do the analysis. And years gone by, this stuff might not have been possible. And the way football is moving as an area, there's just so much available to analyse. And for us as psychologists, that's great to see what might be going on behind the effects that we observe. So I can speak a little about the data. So I'll come to the referee disciplinary action stuff in a second. But so when I spoke earlier about the home advantage being half, so what I mean by that is home advantage is typically measured in two ways. The first way is by the number of points a team picks up over the season. So with fans present, before COVID, teams won 0.39 points more per game when playing at home compared to when playing away from home. However, without fans during these lockdowns, the same home teams only won 0.22% more at home relative to when they played away from home. And we see the same pattern for the second marker of home advantage for team performance, which is the number of goals a team scores. With fans present, home teams scored 0.29 goals more per game than away teams. With fans absent, home teams scored just 0.15 goals. So you see this halving of the home advantage, so to speak. And I suppose at this point it is also pertinent to say that there is some fluctuation amongst the leagues. So in some respects, the Premier League is a little bit of an outlier in the respect that it's not as diluted as it is in other leagues. You think about what happened in Greece. I think that was the biggest effect we've seen, and we've seen I think it was around, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but it was much more pronounced than what we've seen in the Premier League. So yeah, this is what the data suggests for the team performance. But I suppose the other really interesting aspect for me was this referee bias that's often reported in the literature, and that suggests that referees are implicated in the home advantage, in that previous studies have said that referees award significantly more decisions in favour of the home team. And other psychologists suggest this is because of the crowd who implicitly influence the referees, right? We're all human beings. We might be influenced by people that are around us. It might come as a shock. And so it might be the case that the crowd implicitly influence referees into making the decisions into their favour. So the second novel aspect of this study that we did is show that this probably isn't the case. Before now, that what we spoke about, the fact that the crowd might affect the referee, but our analysis suggests, I'll touch on in a second, it's probably more to do with the teams themselves. So initially, when we did the first round of analyses, we seen, like other studies have, referees give more fouls against the home team, yet they give this without fans, yet they give a similar number of fouls against the away team. And referees give far few yellow cards against away teams without the fans. So that supports that notion of home advantage. However, and this is really critical, this aspect. So our studies showed that this is probably driven by a team's dominance. So when we measure this variable called dominance, that is a team's control over a game. So the number of shots it has, the number of corners, the number of shots on target. We see the impact of the crowd on the referee is significantly weakened. So what this shows is that all along we've been thinking the home crowd might be influencing refereeing decisions into their favour. More likely to be due with the fact that teams playing away from home are generally more content to sit back and invite pressure on and be outplayed by the home team. And as a consequence, they commit more fouls and pick up more yellow cards and more red cards, which makes sense, right? If you can't catch your opponent, you're more likely to foul them. So it's this playing style aspect driving the data behind this referee aspect of the home advantage. And for the first time, we've revealed that this probably isn't to do with referee bias. So it just shows that referees are perhaps doing the jobs and punishing teams who foul more because they can't get a hold on the game.
And so you look at this piece, and for me, it was quite surprising the stark nature of it. It's sort of you sort of have a suspicion that it might be there, but the numbers really drive it clearly that this is a thing. And therefore, when we look at, I was always fascinated by the idea. So if you look at sort of certain competitions, away goals count when you've got to draw across several legs, away goals count for more. And therefore, that implicit logic is that there is something it's a bit harder to win away than it is at home. So what you've nicely demonstrated is that one of those, I guess that was never scientifically proven, but one of the sort of tenets of competitions is actually entirely valid, that there is something there. And therefore, we can feel that that's a good idea. That seems like a good idea.
Absolutely, yeah. I think from a sporting perspective, in terms of who holds the most advantage, our data is quite clear. Playing at home brings that advantage. And I think if there's any football fans out there listening to this thinking, does my attendance matter? Does me going to watch my local team and spurring them on matter? Well, this data suggests it does. And I know we'll speak about the perhaps limitations of the data set and things like that later. But at the very raw sense, yeah, it does. And it's kind of, as you allude to, it's quite cute in a way that we've kind of not on purpose, kind of invented this away goals rule. And this
correct, because there wouldn't have been by default. There wouldn't have been the science behind it because we didn't have this experiment.
Yeah.
So you've beautifully. I mean, in a way, it's nice that it's not the other way around, right? That you've suddenly got this rule's a terrible idea. You've actually validated something that I think was based probably more on gut instinct than anything else.
Yeah, and I think that shows, if anything, from a psychological perspective, we're thinking about what's happened with the fans and players of former teams that have went on to govern our game. They know what it's like to play in a packed stadium. It's really intimidating. And those people have gone on to write the rules of our game. And that is probably indicative of the fact that they found it harder to play away from home. You listen to former players and the media, and they suggest the same thing. So, yeah, I think it's this implicit thing we thought of for a while, but for the first time, we've kind of got some underpinning evidence for it. And that's not just our study, that we've done. But there's quite a broad range of literature now that's accumulating because of what's happened in COVID to suggest the same thing. There are some slight differences in terms of what people have found in terms of the magnitude of effects that we've got going on and what might be happening in different leagues. I think very recently there's a study being published looking at the MLS, and I think they find that the effect is a little not as strong as it is here. So yeah, there's slight deviations across the globe in terms of what we're looking at here, and I think that comes a lot down as well to the statistical methods that have been used to analyse said data. But yeah, if we're talking about the take-home message here, it is that fans matter and playing at home carries an advantage.
And you mentioned the weaknesses, so why don't we get that out of the way and just sort of look at some of the challenges here and things that you'd highlight to say, because clearly it's not a perfect experiment by any stretch of the imagination, but can you talk us through a little bit some of those aspects?
Absolutely, yeah. So from an experimental perspective, we'd have probably wanted 50-50, right? We'd have wanted 50% of games behind closed doors, 50% with fans, but it was out of our control.
I'm sorry, we're not happy with this. Could you just change things a bit? It's not as scientifically perfect as we'd like.
Exactly. I don't think that went down too well. So there's that aspect of it in terms of the variance within the data. So that's a slight shortcoming. But more worrying for me is the fact that we've just got one season here. We've got in essence a snapshot of the data. We've mentioned that this is a unique opportunity. It's likely not to happen again. Hopefully, it won't because of the other impacts it's had and on life. And so we need to be a little bit cautious in terms of how far we go with our interpretation of it. It's one season. We always talk about in science about replicating studies and thinking about what might be going on behind the data that might be causing the effects. We call these things confounds. So despite the findings being quite clear, there's other factors we didn't consider. So how far the away team has to travel, right? That might have an effect. If you're driving from Bournemouth to Newcastle, that might have a different effect to if you're driving from across the M62. So you tell them Northern from Leeds to Manchester, and yeah, that's a factor that we might have to take into consideration too. Also, there was much variation within the season in terms of the teams. So because of the COVID pandemic, people were socially isolating. They didn't have the access to the teams the players that they might have otherwise had. Other people might come back to me at that point and say, well, it was the same for everybody, same for all teams, and that's a valid point too. But the point is there's been this variation that wouldn't have been there otherwise if this COVID pandemic didn't happen and didn't go on. And then there's other things that other studies have looked at, such as the size of the crowd, the proximity of the crowd to the pitch. We wanted to try and get hold of that data, but it wasn't fully possible. In terms of the referee analyses that we've done, we talk about yellow cards and red cards as separate entities within our study. To my knowledge, because it's quite difficult to get hold of this data, or at least collate it together. That's probably the key thing, collating it together, data handling process of it. Actually, double yellow cards to red cards, do the findings change for that? And so there are several confounds that are going on in the background here, and also things that we haven't considered. So yeah, if in one sense it's like, you've got these really interesting findings, and it's really cool, and it's nice to see. It's nice to see this kind of unconfirmed phenomena come true in some respect. But at the same time, I think we have to be cautious and think just one season. We need to analyse more, and that's what we plan to do. When we've got fans come back now into stadia, we probably want to think about let's compare the season where we've had fans, 2019, 2020. Last year, the season that gone by where there was no fans for the majority of the season, and then this season, and to see what might happen to the home advantage. And that's something for future studies to certainly explore.
You drew the very nice conclusion that people should go to games, should feel good about going to games. And logically, I guess also, therefore, being an away fan also helpful, right? Because you're helping to counteract, in a very small way, helping to counteract the dynamic that you've talked about. So there's a great message there for fans. But I wondered, so what is there anything else that we can kind of conclude from this? I mean, I love the fact that you've confirmed something that was sort of we all naturally suspected. Is there anything else that we can sort of draw from it and say to ourselves, well, that's interesting. That could inform thinking.
So, from a social psychology perspective, the home advantage theory has been long informed by some really early work in the 1800s by Emily Dunher, and its social social cohesion theory, the idea that we're human beings, as primates, we originate from working in groups. And there's certainly, when you want to think about the broader implications of the research and what it kind of stems from, in essence, it's that humans belong in groups. Well, that's what the data suggests. They belong in groups to some extent, and they feel comfortable with. And there's so much research out there if people are interested in group and out group. And that's not a particular area of my expertise that I can go into much more detail about. But yeah, in group and out group, social psychology norms, and what people, how that influences different behaviours, is something that this research could certainly tap into. But yeah, as I say, I think that might be a job for another guest and another day.
And I mean, you talked about sort of thinking about continuing. Can you talk a little bit about your broader field as well? Because I know this space. This isn't the only bit that you've looked at. Where's your research going to take you going forward, as well as continuing this? And what other areas have you looked at that are sort of related to this?
So, as I said at the start, my research areas are very much to do with health psychology and sports psychology. So I'm really interested in sport performance. And one of the things that comes from health psychology, the other area of interest is stress. I'm really interested in stress and how this kind of pervasive mechanism can impact our lives. And what we know from the literature on stress and how that relates to sport performance is that it can have either a very useful impact or a very damaging impact. You might have heard of this, this inverted U hypothesis, whereby there's some happy medium. And what I'm interested in is thinking, well, what circumstances do we need to put into play for athletes so that they can perform at their most optimum levels? And when we look at a lot of the stress literature, which has moved in recent years to the adaptive response from stress, right? So, if we experience a stressor, our number of changes happens to our physiology, our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, pupils dilate, we get this fight or flight symptom. And that's all well and good, and that's fine. That's a safety device to keep us from danger. But what's a slight problem from that now in the 21st century is when we evade that stressor, when we move away from it, we tend, because we're human beings and we have cognitive processing that's far beyond most of the primates, we tend to think about it, like we worry about it, we ruminate about it. And what we know from a lot of what evidence is beginning to suggest now is that this can have a long-term impact on our health. And what I'm interested in is seeing what impact that might have on sport and performance, and kind of bridging the gap between the two disciplines. And ultimately to try and create and think about some interventions that might help athletes, might help people. And some of the work I've done at Leeds with Daryl O'Connor, Andrew Presswich, has touched on that, really. Trying to think about what are these interventions, what are these best mechanisms, what are the best techniques to try and reduce, these negative thoughts, these worries. And I know that's a little bit off kilter to home advantage, but that's the general area.
No, but I think it's all fascinating because it all comes from that when we think about sport, and I think particularly professional sports players. I mean, clearly it'll impact. Some of these dynamics will impact anybody who's playing, particularly, let's just say anybody playing football is going to have some of these dynamics kicking in. But what I think is really interesting about, we look at professional athletes. And on the one hand, we say, well, they're paid a ton of money and your job is to go out there and perform. And, if I had all the time in the world, I could be really good type logic. But they're under huge amounts of pressure. And I think it's very interesting when the way I would combine those two things would be to look at it and say, actually, the crowd is having an influence on what's going on the pitch, right? So your logic says we should be there to support them. That has an impact. But equally, there's lots of psychological dynamics that are being influenced. And I think particularly with heavy amounts of media coverage and all the sort of noise that goes with it, these people are under huge amounts of pressure. And I think it's fascinating that we've taken something where there is any human being involved in the activity in whatever form is going to be influenced. But there's a pressure cooker here that is driving dynamics. And as you say, on the one hand, that can drive excellence. On the other hand, that can drive Naomi Osaka type situations where people are under huge amounts of, or Simone Biles, or huge amounts of mental pressure that's leading to particularly bad outcomes. And I find this fascinating because I don't think, the average viewer is not thinking in those terms. But yet the pressure the players are under and the referee, anybody involved in this, huge amounts of pressure on them. And so I think it's fascinating to unpick all these dynamics and say, actually, back to your point around natural instincts versus, artificially creating those natural instincts and natural reactions, that's probably massively amplified in the sense of, particularly for professional sports people. So I think it's a fascinating area to explore, because we talk about we don't want to exploit animals in circuses anymore. And yet there's a real risk with professional sports people that we do push them into interesting spaces, and those dynamics, and thinking about how we look after athletes as well as getting the best out of them, I think is a really important question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think such a positive movement has been happening recently in terms of the recognition and application of sports psychologists. In many years gone by, you kind of thought, well, you go and see the sports psychologist when you've got something wrong with you, and they'll try and help you and fix you in a way. And that was very much the perception in years gone by. But now there's such a different mindset on it. It's there that sports psychologists, performance psychologists are there to enhance our mental preparation for games. They're there to provide well-being. They're there to help athletes with this pressure cooker you speak of, because no one can prepare you for that. No one can prepare you for that. It's a foreign situation to you, right? And I think it touches upon this aspect you speak of within the home advantage literature, going back to that, of people perform better when they feel supported. And it's probably that isolation aspect when they don't have that support which might hinder their performance.
You talked earlier about the data, and it is, I'm only scratching the surface, right? Because I sort of just am slightly interested in it. But the data that's available to you is incredible. And it strikes me that that's a slightly unnatural thing, because if any of us were in a position where our, performance were being analyzed to that extent, that would feel a bit weird. I mean, we don't like it when, social media companies know a lot about us, when people are sort of taking our personal data. That feels like an invasion of privacy. And yet you've got some people here whose literally every move is analysed by us. That's quite an interesting, it's valuable for you, but it's quite an interesting phenomenon, I would have thought, from a stress perspective, because there's nowhere to hide in a way that the rest of us have opportunities to slink away. If you're in that sort of thing, that in the way rich data for you equals potentially more stress for them.
Absolutely. And what I find really interesting from this perspective is this interplay between perception and reality for those players. So our perception of football players and our perception of referees and people within that space is, whoa, that must be so stressful. Wow, you've got all these cameras looking at you. You've got all these different, as you say, it's not a normal aspect of life. And in recent years, with the invention of technologies and more cameras at games, there's more pressure. We look at that and think, wow, that's so stressful. But what we've got to remember about stress is it's relative. What stresses me out won't stress you out, and what won't stress the next person out. It's the only time we feel stress is when there is a mismatch between our perception of our ability to cope with the demands of our environment and the resources that we have at hand to deal with them. And when we don't have the resources, we'll feel stressed. We'll feel these negative physiological and cognitive consequences. And I think, again, that taps into the role of sports psychologist. It's preparing those athletes that when they move into this environment, these are some techniques that you might want to use and think about. And so, something I find really interesting is the use of mental imagery. There's a lot of literature out there now where we're asking athletes to think about, before you move into that sporting arena, before you start thinking it, before you go and live in that world, picture it in your mind. What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What atmosphere can you feel in the air? And just recreating it in the mind. And I know some of the work that a psychologist called Liam Slack within the refereeing sphere has done is working with referees and looking at this mental imagery aspect, because refereeing is a cognitive task. You've got to make decisions concurrently under pressure and while running and while being tired. And it's about, in your mind, thinking about the different scenarios that might play out in a game, so that when you come to that, subconsciously you already know what to do. You know how to play that situation. And I think that's how you try and remove that aspect of, or best remove that aspect of stress.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting example of where sports psychology is, it's helpful for the sport. And I love the fact that it exists from a spectator perspective, because I think it gets a better experience for us as spectators. But I think there's something fascinating here around sport as a microcosm of the rest of the world. And there's lots of, and the reason I think sports psychology is fascinating is it can teach us a lot about human reaction. So those things that you described apply equally in day-to-day lives for all of us. It's just, it's not happening in a 90-minute situation. It's happening across the rest of our life. And so there are valuable lessons. And with that in mind, I'm intrigued as to sort of, your thoughts on it. Does looking at this in sort of academic terms, does that influence how you go about living your life? Are you taking personal lessons from it?
The way I see sport, elite sport, is it's this exaggerated version of society. So in the same way that people may act indifferently when they're being watched, we think about, from a psychologist perspective, very famous old school experiment, the bystander effect, right? You stand at traffic lights and you think, oh, shall I go? Shall I not? Well, and you see three people walk, and without question, you think, oh, yeah, it must be okay to go.
right. Knowing nothing about them or their level of intelligence or knowledge. right.
Essentially, yeah. You stand, if you were in the street and you've seen somebody pointing at the sky, you have no reason to think that anything's going to fall from it. But you think, oh, what are they looking at? I'll look up. And, we take implicit cues from our environment to help us cope. And, there's still that primitive aspect of human psychology that lives with us today. And I think within the sporting sphere, you kind of see that exaggerated more because of the pressure that those people are on. They've got to perform. They've got 90 minutes. They've got 90 minutes just to get these outcomes. And I think because that environment is much more pressured, some of the behaviours we see are perhaps more exacerbated. And I think that's when you see people losing their heads. And I think I think this is some early data coming from some studies in America to look at this and looking at the profiles of sports stars, people that are able to keep cool under pressure and perform and keep the head versus those that just literally just want to just get so much in the zone and psych themselves up. And I think they're beginning to see that those people that are really, really aroused, psychologically aroused, make more mistakes. And it's an emerging area, and it's just something I find very interesting.
That's fascinating. If you sort of asked fans, what sort of play you want, the players that get pumped up, that are screaming, sort of really passionate about what they do, and we can all think of examples of that. You kind of don't want the quiet person doesn't look like they don't care. But actually, what you've just pointed at is that potentially the one that's sort of putting on the show, the roaring, the kind of chest bumping type stuff. Interestingly, maybe it's the quiet ones that'll be more successful, and that emotional control is fascinating. But again, that's a gut instinct that we have that feels like I want to see passion on display. A lot of talk about passion, and actually, what you've just highlighted there is potentially that's not necessarily always helpful.
Yeah, so it's such a different, interesting dynamic. Like just listening to the different types of music that's played in changing rooms before games. There's so much research. There's so much research out there on exercise, right? Just in the basic sense of exercise. When you want to run faster, you listen to faster paced music. In the real world, when you go shopping and supermarkets want you out quicker, they play quicker music because they know that
right.
Well, they're through there quicker. And so touching on that in terms of the sporting aspect, I think there's certainly a case for future research to look at, the impact of that music beforehand. What does that do to people's arousal and cognitive arousal? And you speak about different personalities and such. I think that touches on management styles as well, right? You look at somebody like Gareth Southgate, during the summer, a very calm, composed individual. Before England's success, there was certainly people out there going, well, is this guy the right man for the job? Is he really going to motivate people? Well, I suppose it just shows there's more than one way to do it, and that worked for him. And then you look at other people. I'm a Middlesbrough fan. Our manager at the moment is Neil Warnock, and he's the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm sure you've seen videos and stuff. And he's been a very successful manager. So I think it's about what works for different people, not trying to be something you're not. But as a society and as an academic discipline in psychology, recognizing that there's these different styles there and different dynamics to behaviour and attitudes to sport that might be behind different amounts of success.
I'm intrigued by your thinking for the future, and you know what motivates you personally in terms of this interest. Where do you see this field going for you in terms of what you want to look at in the future?
So I'm actually really interested. We spoke about today about the different areas of psychology, and we've only been speaking for 40 minutes. We covered a reasonable amount of ground. Is actually compiling it together, and maybe writing a book about this, and thinking about the different aspects of human psychology that influence performance, and thinking about what are the drivers of human behavior that influence success, and bring it together in kind of this into a book, and think about how some of the mechanisms that we've discussed today might lead to more positive performance outcomes for sports stars. Because one thing to remember is psychology as a discipline is very much in its infancy. When you look at some of the other sciences that are within the Faculty of Health, we're still a young science. We're still establishing ourselves, and so for me, it's about bringing together what we know, replicating it to some extent as well, to test the robustness of those findings, and then reporting it. So for me, I'm really interested in just bringing things together, having a helicopter view of things, looking at, I'm very much kind of a bigger picture kind of person. And what then I found really interesting is then I'm going to speak to I'm strict context, I do strictly quantitative work. I'll go and speak to someone who is very qualitative, and they look at the minute granular details of things. And I find it so interesting because I'm just like, wow. So you think of it from a very much a bottom-up perspective, and I think from a very top-down perspective, and bringing those things together maybe is in a book in years to come, as I said. That would be something I'd really love.
I'd love to read that, because one of the things as you were talking, it struck me that if I want to, and clearly I'm never going to be a professional. No one should be paying me to perform in the sporting arena. But as there's lots of books there that you can read that are sort of so-and-so's guide to success. It might be an autobiography. It's sort of, how did Team Sky do so well in cycling? How did the rowing succeed? So we have these sort of isolated things that look at it, and you can learn. But when I read those things, I always sort of find that's very interesting. And I kind of nod sagely as I read the books and think, I will apply some of that. But actually, it's quite difficult when you've read these things to sort of go, what can I take personally from that when I'm not engaged? Particularly if it's not a sport I've ever done or would like to do again. But so I think there's an interesting thing that says, actually, that helicopter view across this piece that says there are lessons that we can learn across the bit from sport that I think would be really useful for the rest of us, because and partly to justify the time I spend watching sport, right? It'd be very, very helpful if I could pretend I was learning something. But I think it'd be fascinating to have this kind of this view, as you say, about what are those dynamics. Because back to this point around sport being a microcosm of human existence, I think there's lots of things that we can glean from. So I would absolutely love you to do that, because I think there'd be a hell of a lot of stuff we glean from it. Because just the way you talk about some of these dynamics and back to that curiosity, I think will make a fascinating read. So I want to encourage you to do that under all circumstances.
Absolutely. So on the other thing that I think I find of interest as well is kind of talked about this earlier, the interplay of perception and reality. So working in sport, living in sport, some of the things that the sporting people do to kind of show their belonging to the crowd, coming back to the home advantage aspect, is actually a perception and not reality. So prime example, you think of a football manager, right? At the end of the game, his team have lost 1-0. The referees have not really done much wrong, but he'll go over to the referee and he'll start pointing at him, and his eyebrows will be up, and he'll be really aggressive, and he'll be shouting really loud. And from the perspective of the crowd, it's like, it's blaming the referee. The referee's cost us here. But in actual fact, what the manager is probably doing is saying, sorry, mate, and I've got to do this to justify our loss. You had a great game today. And so it's not true. When referees manage people, and this might go into other aspects of life, be showing empathy with people to say, look, I really, really don't want to have to do this, but if you don't stop fouling or you don't stop interfering with the game or whatever, I'll have to caution you, I'll have to yellow card you. And the whole time, he's being friendly, but the whole time he's doing it, his body language, the things he's doing with his hands and his face suggest he's really giving that playing a good rollicking. And so the different things that we see as sports fans to what it's goes on at the ground level, I find is very interesting.
That's fascinating. I mean, I guess microphones make that slightly more challenging now because you can hear more. And I guess particularly, there's an interesting question around what happens when there are no crowds there, right? So then it's being done for television as opposed to being done for people on the ground. So the same dynamic would apply. But I think that's really interesting. Is sort of as you say, is that perception matters hugely. Mm-hmm. And from managers, I guess it's about protecting your job and being seen to be doing the right thing and being seen to kind of be proud of what you're doing, standing up for your players. And so you're right. There's a very, I mean, we talk a lot about mind games. It's Alex Ferguson being the prime example of this, and I guess Mourinho and people like that as well. But that is a fascinating. It's very performative.
Absolutely.
And as you say, the perception. I was struck. I don't know if you saw this. There were some contracts for some Paris Saint-Germain players from a few years back that they got the details of, and included in there was a clause that basically it was either fining them or bribing them. I can't remember which, to go and applaud the home fans at the end of every single game. And therefore, that was a way of. Now, I read that. I was horrified. I was like, that should be happening naturally. But it was a fascinating thing, and it was. I don't think it was for every player. It was for certain players, I think, where they felt they might not necessarily be into doing that. Mm-hmm. And again, it's all about perceptions matter and being seen to do that. So while I'm horrified that they're being financially incentivized to do it, on the other hand, it tells you how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting in terms of like the appraisal of that process, regardless of like what they're doing for the camera and what they're doing for the contract or whatever, is there's a lot of research on this variable called locus of control. For people that have an internal locus of control, they attribute failures and success to themselves, right? People have an external locus of control, bob it off on somebody else. And so although the managers and players, and to use one example, might be doing it to the external factors, I think the most successful people, or at least the data suggests, the evidence suggests, the most successful people are those that have that internal locus of control. The people that say, well, actually, the buck stops with me. This is my fault, and I need to acknowledge that and go down this route or whatever. And I think it's quite interesting listening to managers' pre-match discussions with the media, because they kind of build it up to, well, this is an important game for us, but it's not the be all and end all. And then after the game, post-match discussions, it's always interesting to see how they react. And quite often they just protect the players. And yeah, I think, well, okay, on what instances are you not going to protect your players? And what instances are you going to be true? Because we do know that you can't just protect them every single week.
Right, they're not always going to be right.
Yeah, exactly. So you can tell. At least for me, anyway. I when I watch these sorts of things, I think, well, there's definitely an act going on here, and it would be really interesting to be a fly in the wall in the changing room, because I reckon the conversations that are had in the public domain are very different to the ones that go on behind the changing room doors. Right.
And I was going to ask you, have you watched any of these behind the scenes documentaries? So I know Amazon's done a few. There was a Man City one, a Spurs one. Not aware that Leeds have done one, but who knows? Is there, or Middlesbrough, anyone? Is there any sense of have you watched any of those? Any thoughts on those? I mean, clearly they are playing up to the cameras, right? Let's not kid ourselves that we're getting genuinely fly on the wall. But have you watched any of those? And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've seen the Manchester City one, but I think I've seen the Leeds. I think Leeds have done one as well.
Have they?
I think.
Let's check that out.
I think it's called Take Us Home. Which I'm not a Leeds fan, so. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I'm watching those things, and I'm thinking, A, this is very interesting. B, it's great that we have that insight, because in years gone by that wasn't there. But from a performance perspective, I'm thinking, does that drive them on, having that camera there, knowing that in years gone in previous seasons that there's not been this exposure to their behaviour behind closed doors?
Right, because it's almost taking the dynamics we talked about on the pitch behind the that's the attraction of the show, right? To find out what goes on, but you're taking those same pressures that you were talking about, and arguably, at least normally when they go into the changing room, you're out of sight of the cameras, and you're off stage, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, that's a really fascinating question that I've not fully thought of before. And I'd be interested now, and I know there's only been a small number of teams that have been exposed to these documentaries and things, but my kind of experimental head is going now, thinking, oh, it'd be really interesting to do a randomized control trial of clubs that have had this, clubs that we could put this this behind closed doors notion into their change rooms and see what happens to performance, to see what happens over the course of a full season. And because of course you can't just look at Tottenham Hotspur who've done one, look at Manchester City who've done one, and think, oh well, this is going to affect it because they're just two clubs. But yeah,
Right.
I think it'd be interesting to see in years to come when we see more of this kind of thing happening, or at least that's where it looks like the space is going, to see how the sports stars react.
Yeah, because you'd be answering the simple question of, is it really worth it? Right, because presumably the reason they're letting cameras in is, sure, they get paid for the show, but there are other potential benefits. And so you'd say to yourself, should you? I mean, you'd be answering the question, should you be doing this or not, or is it a really bad idea?
Yeah, especially there's some scenes, isn't there, whereby people are injured and they're having very sensitive conversations with physios and the psychologists and things. And I think there's certainly a fine line that we need to tread in that respect. And I think as long as we do that, and as long as we give people the privacy on those aspects, and people are consensual to the sports people are consensual to it, then I'm all for it.
I know. I mean, I love watching them. There's no two ways about it. But it does occur to me, it sort of is relevant to the pressure cooker piece, and I think what does being a player mean in the 21st century? Well, the answer is, it's not just you turn up on a Saturday and you kick a ball around for a bit. There's a whole lifestyle, positive and negative, I think, in terms of what it means for them. And it's a very, when you look at how much players are paid nowadays, and I had a previous guest of mine said he actually thought that the amount that players were paid was worthwhile and made economic sense, because you are creating a media product that is very unusual, which is something that people will tune into at a fixed point in time, in a way where it's very few things that you have to watch live and that you have to watch on a regular basis. And actually sport generates that. And so that's eyeballs that you don't get from any other context, and therefore worth quite a bit. And so that, I think there's something very interesting around what does that career mean, and the pressures on those individuals, and therefore what does that do to their performance. So I think the area that you're looking at, it's fascinating to watch what happens on the pitch, but I think that broader context clearly is driving some of those dynamics. If you've had a lot of press intrusion, it's going to impact the way you are on the pitch, I'm guessing, to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we look at, so if we think about this in the kind of macro sense, right? We think of sports stars and we think of what's going on, what's going on in their lives, and we see the kind of this public sphere that they're operating. But if we just strip it back a minute and think about, well, this is their job, right? There's a lot of literature within psychology that's looked at this. It looks at the job strain, right? This kind of interplay between the amount of demand that's in your environment and the amount of control you have over it. And what we know is that when there's people that have a lot of high job strain, that this is linked to a lot of negative outcomes. And what's kind of interesting is, because, as you allude to, right, one of the first times that we've been able to see what's going on behind closed doors, and we're being able to see what is happening to elite sports stars. And yeah, granted, they are vastly different in terms of their working environment to the 9-to-5 job, but the amount of demand placed upon them relative to the amount of control, that's a study. That is a study that I think has got legs. And to see their perceptions of it, because the other thing to mention at this point is, and quite rightly to some extent, the clubs have got to protect the players, and they've got to make sure that they are switched on for game days and not speaking to researchers. But the other point to make is, I think there's certainly scope to collaborate with clubs and with personnel. And if anyone's listening and would be interested in that, I certainly would be, to think about in the build-up to games, what happens to people's physiology, what happens to people's cognitive functioning, and to see how that pans out amongst different demographics and different people. And so one study that there's quite an abnormality, really, an outlier, sorry, to the general norm. Is my colleagues Nick and Eve Sandy Wolfson, who I did this home advantage paper with, went into a youth setup. I think it was in the northeast of England, and they measured testosterone of players. Right, because another factor of this home advantage thing, to go back to that, is that you're playing at home. You've got great. You need to impress. You need to put on a performance, and testosterone is linked to is linked to that at the very basic level. So what they found was that when teams were playing at home, then players had significantly higher cortisol levels to when they played away from home. And so there's all these different, we speak about these global trends in the data and things that we've talked about today, but there's actually much more that we can do to see what happens to actual human functioning before performance at the elite level.
Wow, there's a thought for us. Wow, thank you so much for one, doing the research, because you satisfied my curiosity, and I think made us all feel more comfortable about the away goals rule. So that's an absolute bonus. But secondly, it's been you've piqued a ton more questions, and one of the biggest compliments I can pay to my guests is that they've inspired me and they've entertained me, and you've absolutely done both of those things. I will put links to you and your research in the show notes so people can find that if they want to. But all that remains to be said is thank you so much for appearing on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. Take care.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Dane for appearing and to you for listening. To read the research on home advantage that we talked about and some of the other work that Dane is involved with, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're interested in human risk in sport, then have a look in the show notes as well. There are further links to other episodes on a similar theme. To find out more about human risk and to subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter, visit human-risk.com. There you'll find details of some of the work that I do with my clients and some hints and tips about managing human risk in your own organization. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, remember the home advantage, and thanks for listening.